Okay, Madam Clerk.
Our next item is 190260, Mayor Lauren Poe, steps to address nonviolence in the city of Gainesville.
Okay, thank you very much. It has been impossible over the last, well, several years at least, go back as far as you'd like, to open the paper, to turn on the TV, and not hear about gun violence, whether it's right here in Gainesville or in other communities much like our own around the state or in other cities around our country. In every circumstance, we hear a similar refrain from elected officials, from faith leaders, from advocates and lobbyists. But in all of that time, nearly nothing has changed. And so I read to you a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I cannot fathom an argument that would determine that the militia is being well regulated. Not when we've had more than 250 mass shootings this year. Not when more than 35,000 people are being killed by people with guns every year. Not when, of all economically developed nations, 80% of all gun deaths occur in the United States. 86% of all gun deaths killing women occur in the United States. And 87% of all gun deaths killing children under the age of 14 occur in the United States. The militia is not being well regulated. This was a consistent and emotional conversation that I had with so many mayors at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And we have some mayors right here in Florida that are showing great leadership in this area. I spent some meaningful individual time with two mayors during my time at the Conference of Mayors. Two people I'd never met before, two people on whose committees I serve, and they happen to be the mayor of El Paso, Texas, and the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. Two very different people, two people from very different political parties, two different ideologies, and both having to serve their communities in a way that they hoped that they would never have to when they took their oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Mayors and communities across our country are on the front lines of how we protect our citizens from gun violence. So while in Washington and in Tallahassee, our elected officials have been unwilling to take up these important items of consideration that would save lives, it's left up to us at the local level to do what we can. And so what I'm going to ask of the commission is that we ask our policy research staff to come back to us with a series of recommendations to consider that will help us at a local level address gun violence. Some of these are completely within our wheelhouse, and we can do with a little bit of staffing and effort and coordination amongst different local agencies. Some of these things might seem like they can only be addressed at the federal level, and some of these things we absolutely need to work with our state representatives to address. But I want you all to hear from me that I'm not going to stop at preemptions or previous court rulings. We need every city council and mayor in the country that takes this issue seriously to pass local gun reform legislation so it can be challenged in the courts and we can let the legality of letting our citizens be killed be tested. And so these are the areas that I would like our staff to look at and come back to us with some options and some recommendations for action. First of all, we need sensible gun laws. There is overwhelming support for a ban on high-capacity magazines and bump stocks. Immediate action needs to be taken on that. There is overwhelming support for universal background checks with no loopholes. Waiting periods. And an actual assault weapons ban that is effective. These things seem out of our reach and may be, but we need to marshal all of our efforts to do what we can locally and put pressure on our state and federal government to take more widespread and meaningful action. I would like to see some research on gun safety, on what we can do to support gun safety. For the first more than 50 years of its existence, the NRA was exclusively a gun safety and training organization. They did not engage in lobbying. They weren't an advocacy group. They did not put pressure on elected officials. And then in the 70s, all of that changed. We need to look at ways to limit access for youth and people who exhibit certain risk factors of harming themselves or others. We need to expand the lethality assessment that our law enforcement agents conduct. We need to expand background checks. We need to get meaningful domestic violence bills passed. 2/3 of spouse, ex-spouse murders involve guns. There are 12 times more likely to end in death with a gun around, talking about victims of domestic violence. Abused victims are 5 times more likely to be killed if the abuser has a gun in the house. And 2/3 of abusers use a gun as a means of intimidating and controlling the victim of abuse. I've already reached out to our domestic violence providers, and they have a significant amount of research and support for limiting access. And we need to see as a city what we can do and how we can coordinate with the judicial system and our law enforcement agency to assist them. I would like to see some information on how we can affect the gun manufacturers industry. Commissioner Johnson brought up at our last meeting one potential way, which is divestment from manufacturers that produce high-capacity magazines and bump stocks. We need to continue that conversation and put other avenues of pressure on where possible. 5% of the gun dealers in the United States sell 90% of the illegal guns, or guns used illegally by people. 5% of the dealers result in 90% of the illegal guns being out on the street. 90% of the guns used in crimes. Why have we not taken action on that? We need to advocate and, when possible, locally enforce a gun seller's code of conduct that has teeth and repeal immunity laws for gun manufacturers. We need to engage with our responsible sellers and our responsible range owners to help us work on reaching their customers and clients on suicide prevention, mandatory training and licensing of owners, and safe storage. Only 5% of suicide attempts involve a gun, yet 50% of those result in death. 2/3 of people who attempt suicide one time never attempt it again. So if we reduce access to guns for people who have shown risk factors of harming themselves or others, we will save lives. Beyond the trauma that is inflicted on people who are involved in mass shootings, or the trauma inflicted on people who are involved in violent domestic relationships, we're also inflicting trauma on our employees, on our children in school, by constant exposure to Alice drills. Those of us who have children in our schools have probably experienced them coming home in tears because they're convinced that they're going to be murdered where they attend school. That is going to have a far-reaching generational effect on the mental health of all of our children. It already has an impact on our employees, and we have no choice but to do it because of the reality of our situation. The third area I'm going to be asking for policy suggestions is in the area of public health solutions. This is a public health problem, and if addressed as such, there are preventable steps we can take to solve this public health crisis. Guns are the leading cause of preventable and premature death in America. If we cannot take seriously preventing the number one cause of premature death in America, we have lost our compass, our moral imperative as a country. And so I will be looking for ways to develop a comprehensive community safety plan, starting with hospital-based intervention programs, working on upstream solutions, many of which Gainesville is already working on and can show leadership to other communities on, such as youth employment programs, neighborhood economic development, safe parks, and addressing vacant land so they no longer are attractive nuisances. Minneapolis, several years ago, instituted a community safety plan to reduce specifically youth violence, much of which was involving guns. In that time, they've seen a 62% reduction in youth gunshot victims, a 34% reduction in youth victims of crime overall, and a 76% reduction in youth arrests involving a gun. We know when we take a community-wide approach towards addressing this public health problem, it works. We also need to look at better identifying trauma in individual people and offering them and connecting them with support. Most people who use a gun are not mentally ill. In fact, our mentally ill population are much, much more likely to be victims of crime, not perpetrators of crime. But most people who do use guns to commit crimes have experienced trauma previously in their life. And therefore, we need to do a better job as a community to help people understand what trauma is and help find them treatment to address the impacts of that trauma. We need to invest in mental health and well-being, and we are doing good work on that. I have been having a series of meetings with Meridian Behavioral Health, as well as Chief Jones has been involved in those conversations. We are expanding that circle to create a true central receiving facility, so our law enforcement officers have an option of a place to take people other than jail when they're experiencing crisis or trauma, to actually get aligned with treatment instead of incarceration. We need to promote healthy norms of masculinity. A version of toxic masculinity has become accepted as normal in our culture. We see it on display at these meetings, both from the dais and from the audience. We see it in the movies and the TV shows we watch. We see it on press conferences from elected officials and celebrities and athletes. We as a community have got to raise up the men in our community who exhibit healthy norms of masculinity, so our young boys can grow up understanding what it really means truly to be a man, instead of being a predator. And finally, we need to look at how we can incorporate technology to better increase gun safety, to increase our ability to track firearms as they are stolen, and to make sure that they are not used by people who are not intended to use them. There is much more involved in this issue. One thing that I'm asking from all of you is your consent and support for me to work with mayors around the state of Florida and around the country. I do believe there is a critical mass of mayors from cities large and small who are unwilling to wait any longer for state and federal action. And I believe that is where we have the power to really make a difference. And so I have already been in excellent conversations with many of these mayors. I want to expand that group. And I think if we're really able to do that, and if the more than 250 mayors who signed on to the letter to Congress through the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the dozens and dozens of mayors around the state of Florida who take this seriously and are under the same pressure that I feel to take meaningful steps to keep our residents safe, can all take similar actions, we're going to have both an immediate positive impact on our community in trying to address the effects of gun violence, but also, and probably more importantly, put significant pressure on our state and federal elected officials to let them know this is what their constituents, this is what the people who elected them, this is what the people who are depending on them to protect their health and safety are asking for. So I thank you for listening to me. I sat in the seat Commissioner Johnson is sitting in several years ago when a teenager walked into an elementary school and murdered kindergartners. And I mistakenly drew a link between that event and mental health. And I got very interested in addressing the mental health issues of our city. I was in air in the time between those children getting killed at Sandy Hook and August 15th, 2019. Tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. And I cannot in good conscience sit in this seat and continue to hope that something happens somewhere else. And I hope that you all feel the same way, and I hope we can be unified on our willingness and our determination to address this here in our community. So thank you for indulging me. Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Mayor Poe, for putting it all out there so eloquently, and I move your recommendations.
Okay, motion and a second. Thank you, Commissioner Ward and Ariola. Commissioner Warren.
I likewise thank you for the way you've brought this forward. As many times as I've listened to elements of the gun violence, I've never heard it put that way of the militia is not being well regulated. And I think that could be the rallying cry there. Just to remind individuals that when we look here, so I fully support your engagement with other mayors. I think there is some momentum going. Sadly, it's, how many tragedies do we have to have? But the recognition that there are people being killed every day throughout our cities, and we don't have a better way to regulate our militia. If there was an individual who was a member of a soldier who was a member of the Army who misbehaved, there would be a course of action. And we need to recognize that there needs to be better regulations. And I agree, no assault rifle needs to be in the hands of a private citizen. Mentioned that we've got some Green Dot and Kids in Capes. We've got some activities locally that are helping the conversation at a community level about violence and encouraging people to step up when they hear somebody moving into a violent activity or conversation. So I hope we'll include those engagements here in this community, but certainly to get the mayors involved across this country is a great step. Thank you for taking that.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I also want to thank you for your leadership on this. I know that personally I have felt powerless in the past, I'd say years, but especially the past few weeks with everything that has been going on. And these are some really, really clear and really powerful steps that I think that we can take, and that you can take, and you have my full support. And you're right that I think that it's going to need to be tested in the courts, and I think the powers of the city, of the cities coming together is going to be the tipping point, and it's going to make the difference, because clearly for the past decade, nothing has made a difference. So this is really a really, really powerful step, and thank you for doing this, because I believe that now I have a little bit of hope. I feel like we actually will be able to make a difference, certainly in our city, and even more so a little piece on a national level. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Jesus.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your bringing this forward and your leadership. I fully agree. We cannot sit by and do nothing. So I fully support us doing as much as we can, and even more than we may currently think that we can. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Good. Thank you. Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very briefly, I want to say, back in when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, DUI was a traffic offense. It was common for people to smoke cigarettes in rooms like this, and in movie theaters, and in airplanes, and in doctors' offices. But people got together and formed groups and said, this is not acceptable anymore. And when I say people, I mostly mean moms. And that's what's happening again with this. Moms Against Drunk Driving made enormous changes in the 1980s and early 90s about DUIs. Mostly moms made changes about smoking and helped us all understand that it's really just not a real smart thing to do. And we see the results of both those things. And I appreciate Moms Demand Action for being at the forefront of this particular moral crusade. And I follow your lead. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did want to, we'll invite members of the public to come in and speak to this in a moment. I did want to give, I got most of my initial policy assistance and direction from a few major sources, and I did want to just share those with people if you want to follow up. I'm happy to share them with folks. So first of all, there was an excellent report put out by Every Town for Gun Safety, co-sponsored by the National Education Association and American Federation of Teachers on keeping our schools safe. I also, actually, probably the most influential source I used was a report called Key Findings and an Action Plan to Reduce Gun Violence, released by the Police Executive Research Forum. I also used a report put out by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And finally, there was a very large and comprehensive report put out by the Urban Institute. There's also, if any of you want to go follow up and look, there is a group that's based in Oakland, California, that deals with a broad range of community health initiatives, including gun violence, called the Prevention Institute. So I encourage any of you to look them up. They are doing some pretty amazing work with some real data-driven results in a wide range of areas. But I mainly accessed their information on gun violence and gun violence prevention. And so that was instrumental as well. So I don't know, that's that old history guy in me. I want to cite my sources. I didn't think of these on my own in a vacuum, but really tried to find credible and reputable sources that have looked at this both from a law enforcement perspective and a community health perspective. With that, I'd like to invite members of our public to address this issue if they'd like. The motion is up there on the screen if you'd like to refer to that.